Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to Chris and Tobias for the invitation to participate in this awesome series. I've attended a few of the other talks, unfortunately, not as many as I'd like, but yeah, I'm sure, especially those of you who attended Bill Ramsey's talk, there will be some nice continuities, nice connections to some of the others in this series. Okay, so oops, make sure I can move. Here we go. So philosophers' discussions of representation have been fueled by a sort of well-worn collection of cases that I'm sure will be familiar to those of you here. So, Fodor introduced discussions of fly detectors. Hubel and Wiesel in their experimental work gave us edge detection and edge detectors. And place cells have been a sort of fixture of philosophical theorizing about representation too, including in this paper by Bechtel and other works. But the thing I want to point out as sort of the starting point for my talk is that these familiar examples are sort of strikingly homogeneous. Most of them represent something in the environment. So they purport to represent something about what the world is like. And I think that that shows that for philosophers, the paradigmatic representational state is a state with descriptive content. There's this hegemony of descriptive states in our theorizing about a representation. But in my view, that's kind of a problem. This limited stock of examples is problematic if our aim, as I think it is to account for the role of representation in the mind and brain sciences in general. Because a lot of the representations that psychologists and neuroscientists posit don't have a sort of straightforwardly descriptive character. So you'll hear researchers talk about motor commands or error signals or internal tracking states. None of these are about the state of the world. So in my talk today, I want to try to sort of scratch the surface, just start to remedy this philosopher's relative neglect of representations that aren't descriptive with respect to one question in particular and one particular set of non-descriptive states. So the question that I want to discuss comes from Bill Ramsey. It's the job description challenge, which is the challenge of answering what makes a physical state a representation. But what I want to do, this question has been much discussed, but what I want to do here is pose this question specifically with respect to directive states instead of the usual descriptive states. So I'm going to try to just big picture overview here. First, I'll point out that existing treatments of the job description challenge are geared toward descriptive states implicitly. And then I'm going to try, in the bulk of the talk, I'm going to try to reformulate the job description challenge for directive states and sketch an answer to it, try to propose an answer that I hope you'll find plausible. And I'll say more in a moment about this distinction between descriptive and directive states. But for the first, before I turn to that, just a brief overview of the job description challenge. Again, this is probably familiar for lots of people here. But in his really important book, Representation Reconsidered, Ramsey distinguishes two philosophical questions you can ask about representation. The first is what makes a state of a physical system a representation in the first place? And the second is what gives a representation the content that it has? So in virtue of what does a representational state have a particular content? Now, Ramsey thinks that this second question, can you see my mouse? Looks like it, right? Yeah. Ramsey thinks that this second question has gotten a lot of philosophical attention, but the first question has been relatively neglected. So we have a lot of different proposals about what gives a representation the content it has, but not so much about when a physical state or structure is a representation and when it's not. So he thinks we need to focus more on this first question. And if we think of to answer that question, or to sort of elaborate on that question a bit, Ramsey adopts the common view that representation is a functional concept. So a state is a representation if and only if it plays a particular functional role. And if we take that view on board, that to be a representation is to have a particular function in a system, then this first question becomes, what makes a state of a physical system function as a representation in that system? So this is the job description challenge, answering the question, what makes a state or structure of a physical system function representationally? And so the job description challenge is to characterize the functional role that a mental and neural state plays in a system, in virtue of which it counts as a representation. sorry, missing a typo there, but as a representation. Um, yeah, and I will talk about states in this talk, but Ramsey poses the challenge for both states and structures. So that's the challenge. And in the course of reading, if you read Representation Reconsidered in the course of the book, it becomes clear that Ramsey thinks that there are a number of constraints on a potential answer to the job description challenge. So we want our answer to satisfy a number of desiderata. First, he thinks our answer should overlap sufficiently with our pre-theoretical notion of representation. So however we characterize the job description of representations, it should capture something about our sort of intuitive notion. It has to be naturalistically respectable. So by that, he means that our characterization of the job description shouldn't itself invoke intentional concepts. It should make the representational theory of mind an interesting empirical thesis. So whatever the job description turns out to be, it should make it an empirical question whether the mind or brain uses representations. And finally, it should be neither overly liberal nor overly restrictive. So it should make representations not too hard to come by, but not too easy to come by either. So in what follows in the next couple slides, I just want to focus a little bit more on these first and last constraints. I don't actually think that these are entirely independent, but I'm gonna present them separately just for clarity's sake. Okay, so the first one I'm going to call the pre-theoretic constraint. And here's what Ramsey says. He says, representational notions already have a home in our non-scientific conception of the world. This non-theoretical understanding constrains the sorts of things that can qualify as representational states, even in the context of a scientific theory. So in other words, however we understand mental or neural representation and its job description, it should have some resemblance to our intuitive understanding of representation. And what this means for Ramsey is that it should reflect, capture features of paradigmatic, intuitive, everyday examples of representations. So according to Ramsey, these sorts of common sense examples of representations include things like maps, tree rings, thermometers, compass needle positions, and so forth. So these are things that we intuitively treat as representational, and whatever answer we land on about what makes a mental or neural state of representation, Ramsey says it should capture something about these paradigmatic examples too, right? In order to deserve the name representation at all, there should be some continuity between our job description and these intuitive examples. So that's the pre-theoretic constraint. The second constraint I want to zoom in on a little bit is what I'll call the Goldilocks constraint. And this is that an answer to the job description challenge should make it an empirical possibility that there are representations in the mind and brain, but it should not lead to pan-representationalism. So it shouldn't make it impossible to ascribe representational content to physical systems, but it also shouldn't lead us to find representations like absolutely everywhere in nature. So we have to strike this balance. So the Goldilocks constraint, right? It's about this balance, but I think it's fair to say that Ramsey is particularly worried about one of the two dangers, right? About the risk of over attributing representations. And in particular, in the book, he talks a lot about how he thinks that some of our current representation concepts don't satisfy this constraint. They are too liberal. So he talks in particular about this receptor notion. So he thinks that this is a very common concept of representation in cognitive science. And this is what the notion is. He writes, because a given neural structure is regularly and reliably activated by some distal condition, it should be regarded as having the role of representing that condition. So a receptor, right, is a thing that is attributed content by cognitive scientists simply because it is regularly and reliably activated by some distal condition. So you might think that if we call edge detectors representations, that is invoking this receptor notion, because all that, these cells that Hubel and Wiesel measured, all that they're doing is responding regularly and reliably to a bar of a particular orientation. All right, so that's the notion of representation. Ramsey's arguing that the receptor notion is overly liberal. If we attribute content to, or if we say that any state that reliably responds to something has representational status, that just makes representations that makes it such that representations are going to be found everywhere. It really trivializes this notion. So Ramsey thinks that we should think of receptors as causal mediators rather than genuine representations. All right, those are the two constraints I wanted to zoom in on, the Goldilocks constraint and the pre-theoretic constraint. Now, next thing I want to do is point out that the way that we usually conceive of the job description challenge really centers descriptive states, descriptive examples. And so in this section, I'm going to sort of suggest how we might extend our conception of the job description challenge to apply to directive states too. But before starting that, I need to address this distinction. So in philosophy, the distinction between the descriptive and the directive in this area is usually drawn with respect to representation, right? So we can talk about descriptive representations or directive representations. There are other terms too, imperative and so forth for these labels. But this is the way it's commonly drawn. Here is a kind of representative characterization from Patrick Butlin. He says that descriptive representations purport to say how things are, and so they can be true or false, right? If you have a state that purports to say how things are, then that state can be true, or then that can be true or false. Whereas directive representations tell the systems that consume them what to do and can be and thus can be satisfied or unsatisfied. So a directive representation issues a command in a certain way, and then as a result, it can be satisfied or unsatisfied, but not true or false. So that's the familiar distinction. This is a bit of a subtlety, but the job description challenge is about states that might or might not be representations, right? So I can't take this distinction exactly because the representational status of a state is exactly what's at issue when we're talking about the JDC. So for the purposes of this paper, I broaden the distinction a little bit to talk about descriptive states and directive states, where those may or may not be representations. So here's a very loose characterization. Descriptive states carry information about the world, and directive states shape what a system does. And again, with that characterization, you can have descriptive states that carry information in a representational way or not, and you can have directive states that shape what a system does in a characteristically representational way or not. So as I said, I know this is a little bit loose, but I think it's often clear whether a particular sort of state is descriptive or directive, or possibly both. And there are kind of some standard examples that help flesh this out too. So when we talk about descriptive states, the sort of paradigm examples are perceptual states or sensory states. And then when we talk about directive states, there are sort of a variety here. At the personal level, we can think of desires and intentions as being directive. And then subpersonally, you might think of motor schemas as directive, motor neuron activations, and so forth. All right, so I'm interested in directive states, as I said. And when we're trying to apply the job description challenge to directive states, what we're really asking is, what is the role that a directive state in particular have to play in a physical system to count as a representation? So what role does a directive state have to count as representational? The first point I want to make here, sort of building up to an answer, is just that to entertain this question, we have to slightly expand our thinking about the job description challenge. And in particular, we've got to flesh out those constraints on an answer that I just talked about. We have to flesh them out a little bit differently. So first, let's look back at the pre-theoretic constraint. So I already said that Ramsey thinks that our scientific conception of representation has to reveal some commonality between neural or mental representations and pre-theoretic examples of representations like maps, tree rings, thermometers, compass needle positions, and so forth. The first thing I want to bring out here is that all of these examples represent how the world is, right? That is, they're descriptive and not directive representations. So I think that means we need a different set of examples if we're trying to think about how this pre-theoretic constraint applies to the directive domain. And I want to suggest that some intuitive representations that seem to have directive content rather than descriptive content include blueprints. So blueprints for a contractor tells a contractor where to raise a wall. Assembly instructions for IKEA furniture. There's one example that Ramsey does mention, traffic lights, traffic signals and signs that I think sometimes have imperative or directive content. Airport scanner footprints. I want to say that, I want to suggest that the content of these footprints is put your feet here, right? It's a directive content. And finally, flower markings. Certain flower markings might be a candidate, like these ultraviolet patterns that tell bees or other insects where to land on a flower. Maybe there's a case to be made that those markings convey something directive. So I'm not sort of individually committed to any of these examples, but I think that we do have intuitive notions of directive representations, and so a satisfactory answer to the job description challenge would show some continuity between these common sense examples or similar common sense examples and the directive states in the mind or brain that we want to treat as representations. Okay, now the Goldilocks constraint. Again, this is the idea that we should be neither too liberal nor too restrictive in our representational ascriptions, with an emphasis really on the dangers of over-ascription. And as we saw, the focus of Ramsey's discussion is on the overly liberal receptor notion. But the receptor notion is obviously descriptive, right? A receptor is something that responds reliably to some feature of the environment. So for directive representations, to understand what the threat of pan-representationalism would look like, I think we need a different contrast. So we need, again, to flesh out this constraint a little bit differently to capture the threat of over-ascription in the case of directives. I think this is a genuine worry in the case of directives too, right, over-ascription, because there are surely states of physical systems that are causally involved in the production of an action, but whose contribution is not representational in character, right? So I'll try out two examples on you. One I'm taking from Carolyn Price. So she talks about how the squeezing motions of the heart usually cause the blood to distribute oxygen and nutrients around the body. But it's not the case, right, that the states of the heart represent directively the distribution of nutrients, right? The heart doesn't represent the directive content, distribute oxygen and nutrients. It doesn't, right, command something to the blood. It doesn't issue a command to the blood. And so I think to satisfy the Goldilocks constraint for the directive job description challenge, we've got to make sure that we're not attributing representational status to something like the heart, right? To just any old state or structure that is causally involved in some action or movement. So just as in the descriptive case, according to Ramsey, we should steer clear of the receptor notion of representation. In the directive case, I want to suggest that we need to make sure we're not going as far as what I'll call this trigger notion of representation. So a trigger is just a state or structure that reliably brings about a particular behavior in the system that contains it. But not every such state is a directive representation, right? Because not every trigger functions as a representation. So the heart is one example of a trigger that I think we want to call non-representational. Another example that I briefly mentioned, I think, in a different context, is a motor neuron. So a motor neuron, of course, is a neuron in the spinal cord that sends projections out of the spinal cord to innervate, in some cases, a skeletal muscle. And when the motor neuron fires, it makes the muscle more likely to contract, right, through the release of neurotransmitter. But I think that the firing of the motor neuron is best seen as a trigger of muscular contraction, not a representation, right? Again, the motor neuron is not commanding the muscle to contract. It doesn't represent the content, contract muscle or something like that. It just causes it. All right, so that gives us, putting this all together, that gives us this sort of slightly tweaked job description challenge that I'll call the directive job description challenge. So to answer that JDC, I think we've got to characterize the role that a directive state must play to count as representation. And the answer that we give has to satisfy these constraints. It has to capture the features of things like red lights, blueprints, assembly instructions, and so forth that also make them representational. And it's got to propose an answer. The answer shouldn't generalize to mere triggers. So those are the sort of, again, slight recharacterizations of Ramsey's constraints to help flesh out this directive version of the job description challenge. All right, that's the task. I now want to very, very briefly talk about how I think proposed solutions to the JDC that you find in the literature don't apply straightforwardly to this directive version of the job description challenge. Now, to sort of introduce these existing solutions, I'm going to talk about three. They're sort of close to a consensus that the beginnings of an answer to the job description challenge comes from the idea that a state plays a representational role only if it stands in for something else. So here's Hoagland saying very common view, that which stands in for something else is a representation, and that which it stands in for is its content, and it's standing in for that content is representing it. So there's a bunch of people who agree with this. One recent paper disagrees, but this notion that representation and standing in for are closely linked is quite common. But as Bechtel has pointed out in this 98 paper, even though there's agreement about that, an agreement about the importance of standing in for, there's no agreement, or there's very little agreement about what that amounts to. And so the different solutions that you can find in the literature, solutions to the job description challenge, are basically different ways of fleshing this out, different understandings of what it means for one state to stand in for something else. So here are the three answers that I want to briefly mention. First, some people argue that a physical state functions as a representation only if it tracks something in the world. So if it stands in for something in the world by tracking that thing. A second answer that has been provided or proposed is that the job description of representations is to enable surrogative reasoning. So a physical state stands in for something else. It functions as a representation only if it enables surrogative reasoning. So by that, they mean that the state is used as a surrogate in our thinking about something else, like in a mental model, for example. And then finally, another proposed answer is that a physical state functions as a representation. It stands in for that thing, or it stands in for something else only if it is decouplable from that which it represents, from the stimulus it represents. Okay, so those are three existing answers. The problem here, I think, is that none of them is clearly applicable to directive states. Just as the job description challenge has been focused on the descriptive case, the posing of the challenge has been geared toward the descriptive case. The answers, the solutions, have likewise been geared toward the descriptive case, and I don't think it's clear that any of these really answers are directive job description challenge. So first of all, I think most obviously, directive states don't, or directive representations don't have to track something in the world, right? That's just not their function. So I think this is a sort of a non-starter when it comes to answering the directive challenge. As far as the second one goes, to be frank, I'm not sure I fully understand what surrogative reasoning is, but to the extent that I do, it seems to make most sense in the descriptive case, where mental states are acting as surrogates in like a mental simulation of the world, like you've got states standing in for objects in the world or something like that. But again, that's not that doesn't clearly transfer to the case of directives. I'm not entirely sure what it would mean for a directive state to play or to enable surrogative reasoning. I should mention in the paper version of this talk, I do briefly address a conception of surrogative reasoning that would apply to directive states. It was actually suggested to me by Bill Ramsey the last time I gave this talk. So if you're curious about that, there is certainly more to say. But I think if we want to apply this conception to the directive job description challenge, there's at least more work to be done to flesh it out. And then finally, the third answer is that a physical state functions as a representation if it's decouplable from the stimulus it represents, right? So you can token the state even when the object that it represents isn't present, or even when, the object is seen under different conditions. And I think this works actually as an answer to the job description challenge for descriptive states, for perceptual sensory representations, but not for representations of other kinds. Right? You're not representing a stimulus in the world when you're talking about directive states. So we can talk more about these existing proposals later if you want, but for the sake of time, I want to sort of take it as motivated that we need a new kind of solution and turn to my positive alternative. So here's my proposal. It's going to take a while to unpack, but starting with it. I think that the third idea I just presented about decoupleability is actually onto something very important about representation. But I think we need a different notion of decoupleability that applies to directive states, right? So decoupleability between a state and a stimulus in the world, that's just not the sort of decoupleability that's going to be relevant when you're talking about directives. But there might be other notions of decoupleability that do apply to directives. So the first observation I'm going to make in moving toward this, in developing this answer to the directive JDC, is that actually there are more types of decoupleability than philosophers often recognize. And when people talk about decoupleability and representation, I think they actually are talking past one another sometimes. They don't always mean the same thing. So this is just a sort of sampling of some of the different things that are being decoupled from one another when people are talking about this notion, and potentially not even realizing that they're talking about different notions. There's also a table in the paper about this that gives some examples of authors who make use of these different decoupleability concepts. Not going to go into detail here, but what I want to just emphasize is that, again, a different sort of decoupleability matters for directive representations. So what sort of decoupleability? Well, I think to answer that, we should consider what the explanatory benefit of directive representations is. So this is a kind of common approach to thinking about representation, thinking about what do we gain when we invoke representations. And of course, I'm going to focus specifically on the directive case. So what is the explanatory payoff of appealing to directive representations? What do we gain from scientific explanations that invoke directive representations? Here's my proposed answer. I think that appeal to directive representations helps explain how a system achieves a particular outcome in the face of varying internal or external conditions. So, in other words, directive representations help explain how the system is able to bring about a particular outcome in a way that is invariant to variability in the local conditions. And this is sort of a meaningful, it's non-trivial, right? Because some physical systems, but not all, contain such states, right? They contain states that only some systems contain states that causally contribute to the production of certain outcomes by prompting different behaviors in different circumstances. And I think attributing content to those special states is what explains how the system achieves something despite variability in circumstances. We say that it represents the outcome to be brought about. So I know that's really abstract. So just to give you an example, I think it's explanatorily useful to talk about certain states of the premotor cortex as representing grasping, right? Directively grasping, because the tokening of those states prompts an organism to grasp in different ways, right? Using different combinations of digits, starting from different hand positions and so forth. So we can appeal to those premotor states when, for example, we want to explain how a non-human primate is able to grasp objects of different shapes or sizes. The premotor state is tokened and it prompts downstream neural activity that can make compensatory adjustments for objects that are, small or awkwardly shaped. So my view is that ascribing directive content to this premotor state makes sense of the primate's goal-directed yet flexible behavior, right? It's the flexibility in the behavior that gives rise to this explanatory payoff. All right, so then in the answer to the question, what is distinctive about systems that use directive representations to control behavior rather than just using triggers, is that they're able to achieve outcomes despite variability in the behaviors required to bring them about. So even when conditions are variable, even when what the system has to do to achieve an outcome is different, the system can still accomplish its goal. I use that goal in a thin way here. So I think the sort of decoupleability that matters for directive representation is decoupleability between the directive states of the system and specific behaviors of the system that achieve a particular outcome. As far as I'm aware, Beckerman is the only philosopher to focus exclusively on this sort of decoupleability, though he applies it to personal level wants, at the personal level. But I think this sort of decoupleability can be used to analyze subpersonal directive states too. All right, so here's what I mean more sort of schematically. Imagine that we have a directive state that causes a particular behavior, which brings about a specific outcome. My thought is that this directive state is a representation only if, had behavior one been unavailable for some reason, then tokening that state would still have caused the achievement of the outcome, but in some other way, right? So the directive state is a representation if there are other behaviors that it, has at its disposal, so to speak, to bring about the target outcome. So that's the picture, and here then is my answer to the directive job description challenge in a nutshell. I think that to play a representational role, a directive state must make a specific causal contribution to bringing about an outcome in a way that is decouplable from any particular behavior. So again, consider the case of the state of premotor in the premotor cortex whose tokening causes grasping. And again, I'm asking you to imagine that it does so by producing different sorts of movements, depending on, the starting position of the hand, the presence of injured digits, and so forth. That premotor state is a representation because it can bring about grasping in different ways, right? The outcome here is grasping, the state is the premotor state, and we've got, move in trajectory 1, move in trajectory 2, and so forth. Those would be the different behaviors. So this is sort of the most important thing of the whole talk, right? This is my proposed answer to the directed job description challenge. I want to unpack it a little bit by talking a little bit more about each of the italicized pieces, starting with specific causal contribution. So here I'm just adopting the notion of causal specificity that can be found in philosophical work on causal selection, where a cause is specific when fine-grained changes to the state, right, to the cause, bring about fine-grained changes in the outcome, right, the effect. And the reason I think this restriction is needed is that there are some directive states that play a causal role in behavior, but not in a way that's particularized to a specific outcome. So think about motor states of the cerebellum that maintain posture and balance. These states are critical for being able to do all sorts of things, right? Like throw a ball. You couldn't throw a ball if you couldn't maintain your posture and balance, if the cerebellum wasn't maintaining your posture and balance. And so causally speaking, those states are crucial, but they don't represent the content throw ball, right? Because they don't contribute to ball throwing in a causally specific way. They contribute to a much broader set of movements. So that's why we need to say that a directive state makes a specific causal contribution to an outcome. Next, what do I mean by outcome? Well, it's what the directive representation contributes to bringing about. And I want to say that here that outcomes can come at very different levels of grain. So sometimes we might be talking about something like yawning, grasping an object, like in the example I've been discussing, or buying a ticket, right? We can talk at many different levels about outcomes. And I think that might seem odd at first, but it actually makes sense given that we attribute directive content at a number of different levels, right? To intentions and goals, and also premotor states and other neural states. So I think it makes sense to think of outcomes quite variably, or to be flexible, I guess, in our characterization of outcomes. Next, behavior. So behaviors are the things that a system does to bring about an outcome. For example, if we think of an outcome as buying a ticket, possible behaviors that would accomplish that outcome could be going to the ticket office, transacting online, giving cash to a friend. So if you think about this example plus the premotor one, you can see that here too we have very different levels of grain, right? Outcomes come at very different levels of grain, and so too do behaviors, which again I think is appropriate given that we ascribe directive content at all sorts of levels. All right, and finally, I'm talking about decouplability from between a state and a particular behavior, right? So what I want to emphasize here is that it's decouplability, not decoupling. What matters, on my view, is whether a directive state could bring about an outcome in multiple ways, not whether it actually does. And so the motivation for this is that I think explanation has a counterfactual element, right? Counterfactual dimension. We can appeal to representations to explain why a system's achievement of an outcome is resilient to possible perturbations, even if those perturbations never actually occur. And this contrasts with, for example, Orlandi's treatment of decoupling. So Orlandi argues that what matters in the perceptual case is actual decoupling between a stimulus and a state, but I want to argue that it's actually just counterfactual possible decoupling. All right, so that's my proposal. That's my proposed answer to this directives job description challenge. I just want to flag here before concluding this section that I think this view satisfies those constraints that I characterized a few minutes ago. So I think my view can roughly capture what makes those intuitive examples representational. So if you think about a flashing yellow traffic light, I actually don't know how internationally universal this is, but in the US, right, a flashing yellow traffic light means slow down or, be careful, slow down, be cautious. But there are different ways that drivers can exercise caution, right? They can listen for other cars, they can slow down, they can put their foot over the brake. And I think that helps to explain why the flashing yellow light has directive content. It's a representation because it causes a certain outcome through the promotion of different sorts of behaviors. Uh, and then the Goldilocks constraint, I think the account doesn't ascribe representational status to mere triggers, which is the outcome we wanted, right? And that's because it implies that if there's a mental or a neural state that causally contributes to a behavior, but not in a way that's causally specific, or not in a way that is invariant over possible behaviors, then it's not a representation. So it excludes triggers for that reason. The heart, for example, doesn't represent distribute nutrients because it can only causally contribute to the distribution of nutrients in one way, right? Namely by circulating the blood. And likewise, for the motor neuron, it can only cause muscle contraction in one way, right? By firing action potentials. It doesn't have multiple behaviors at its disposal with which to bring about this muscle contraction. So I think, hooray, right? The account has the right verdict here that these are not representations. All right. It looks like time permits. If you want me to wrap up, okay, yeah. I'll go quickly through 2 objections and replies. First, you might worry, I think this is maybe the most serious worry about the view. You might worry that you could always find decoupleability between a state and behaviors of the system if you individuate behaviors finely enough. So a motor neuron, for example, synapses on motor neurons that synapse on skeletal muscles do so in many different locations. So you might think, why can't we just individuate the behaviors of the motor neuron in a very fine-grained way? So here we have the firing of the motor neuron. That's the state. And here's its behavior number 1, causes neurotransmitter release at site A. But if site A is unavailable, it can cause it at site B or site C, right? So maybe these are individual behaviors. And each of these individual behaviors causes muscle contraction. So you might say, well, it looks like the motor neuron has a number of different ways of causing muscle contraction, a number of behaviors that are available to it. And so it is representational, right? It satisfies my conception. And similarly for the heart has, you might say, the heart has different ways of distributing nutrients. Namely, it can beat at 80 beats per minute or 90 beats per minute or 100 beats per minute, right? These are different behaviors that the heart can exhibit. And so it does exhibit this decoupling that I said is required. So that would be a bad outcome for me, right? Because it would imply that the motor neuron or the heart is representational after all, and so the view doesn't satisfy the Goldilocks constraint. The first thing I want to do, which is not a reply, but it's part of the defensive posture here, I guess, is just note that I think I'm not alone in being vulnerable to this worry. So appeals to decoupleability elsewhere are vulnerable to this individuation problem too, right? So if you think about Burge or Landy, their view, right, is that the thing that's distinctive about perceptual representations is that they can be tokened in a way that's decouplable from a specific stimulus, right? But you could always individuate stimuli really, really finely, such that even very, very early sensory states are decouplable from specific stimuli, right? If you individuate them finely enough, and therefore representational. But that would be bad. That would be anathema for people like Burge. So I think this is a kind of actually underappreciated problem for Burge and Orlandi and others who talk about decouplability. So in that sense, I'm in reasonably good company. But in terms of how to reply, I think there are sort of 2 directions one could go. The first is the first would be to appeal to pragmatics. So you might say that the individuation of behaviors is fixed by the explanatory context. So in most scientific contexts, it doesn't serve researchers' goals to individuate the behaviors of the motor neuron with respect to the firing site, right? Or the behaviors of the heart with respect to the firing rate. And so because distinctions that fine are usually irrelevant, we wouldn't typically say that there are different behaviors here. And so we could maintain that, the heart doesn't have directive content, the motor neuron isn't a representation either. So basically, right, the idea behind this approach would be to use pragmatics as a backstop to the sort of ever finer individuation of behaviors and thereby prevent decoupleability from becoming trivial. Of course, potential downside of this approach is that it relativizes representational status to an explanatory context. So a state could be a representation in one explanatory context, but not another. And, I would have, if you pursued this line, you'd have to say, well, it's possible that there could be an explanatory context in which a motor neuron or a heart is representational after all. So for that reason, you might be moved instead to say that actually we're not going to appeal to context. We're going to say that two behaviors count as distinct only when they're treated as different by a consumer system. So this reply builds on the idea that, for a state to be a representation, it has to be treated as such by a consumer system. And the idea, again, would be to prevent the overly fine individuation of behaviors and the trivializing of the notion of decouplability by appeal to which distinctions a consumer can make. All right, so those are the two options. I don't endorse one or the other, but I think there are at least a couple of ways of going in response to this concern. The second objection I want to address is the worry that my proposed answer to the JDC, the directive JDC, is super revisionary. So it seems it does set quite a high bar for a directive state to count as a representation. And you might think, correctly, I think, that this is a bar that's not met by a lot of the states that psychologists and neuroscientists treat as representations. So researchers often talk about motor commands, goals, and other directive contents being represented by states that don't elicit behavioral flexibility of the kind I've said is required. So if that's the case, then my account seems to delegitimize a whole lot of representational ascriptions in science. My answer here is basically yes, yes, indeed it does. And I think that's actually a feature rather than a bug. So the reason I think it's not such a big deal to be revisionary in this way is that is that there's a lack of conceptual clarity regarding representation in the cognitive sciences. So the term is not used very clearly or consistently by psychologists and neuroscientists. And the work demonstrating this lack of conceptual clarity is mostly focused on perceptual or sensory representation. And so I would venture to guess that the situation is even worse when it comes to directive states, that there's even more unclarity about directive representation. I'm also sympathetic to concerns that there's a general overascription of representational status to mental and neural states by psychologists and neuroscientists. And also that reform is needed when the status quo is as it is. So I think being revisionary about existing practice is actually a virtue, an advantage of the view, given the situation. Okay, so to conclude then, what I've argued today is that we need to tweak the job description challenge for directive states. I signed on to the relatively widespread, or not uncommon view that representations earn their explanatory keep by promoting constancy in the face of variability. I think that's the basic insight of folks who talk about decouplability. But I think different sorts of constancy and variability different sorts matter for different species of representation. And I've argued that the kind of decouplability that's key to answering the directive job description challenge is decouplability between a directive state and behaviors of the system. And then more broadly, I'm joining a few others in arguing that philosophers thinking about representation should pay more attention to non-descriptive states. So there are lots of representations that don't fit the standard sensory or descriptive paradigm. And I think there are tons of interesting questions to be asked about those states. So for instance, are there tasks that are representation hungry in the sense of needing non-descriptive representations, right, to solve them? Or is there an analog of the misrepresentation requirement in the directive domain? Or, are there indeterminacy problems for other species of representation, right, beyond the descriptive ones? But I think we won't be able to sort of tackle those interesting questions unless we bear in mind, Millikan's prescient warning, intentionality is not of a piece. So if I just want to flag, like most of the talks in this series, this paper is recently out in the awesome open access journal Philosophy of the Mind Sciences, and there I go into more detail about objections, replies. I talk about a teleosemantic analog of my causal proposal here. I discuss in much more detail a comparison with Carolyn Price. So please do, I'd be delighted for folks to read it if you're interested in those things. But yeah, thanks for your attention and looking forward to our discussion.